So I think most Americans can sense that American democracy, at least what's left of it anyway, is currently on its deathbed, and things aren't getting any better. In fact, they're getting worse. Putting aside the shameless giveaways to the wealthy in Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill, there's also a hidden provision within that bill that strips power away from federal courts, meaning that they're not going to be able to hold Trump accountable if he continues to ignore their rulings. In addition to that, the Supreme Court seems poised to prohibit courts from issuing nationwide injunctions, which have blocked Trump from implementing some of his most dangerous policies. And on top of that, as Esquire puts it, the Supreme Court granted Trump presidential power not seen since King George III, which allows his unconstitutional firing of agency heads to stand while their cases are adjudicated, even though Congress, and Congress alone, is supposed to be the only institution with the power to fire them. And these are just some examples. We haven't even touched on the weaponization of agencies that are supposed to be independent, like the FCC, who's going after Trump's media critics for him while he's filing defamation lawsuits against them, not to mention the corporate capitulation to Donald Trump's fascism, or how he signed an executive order to effectively turn America into a police state by putting militarized cops on the streets and giving them immunity in the likely event they abuse power. So needless to say, the situation is pretty bad. But a bad situation doesn't necessarily mean that all hope is lost. And I say this because even though media and academic institutions are being punished for criticizing this administration, we're still able to criticize him, at least on this individual level, without much fear of reprisal. Much fear, right? And while some states have put restrictions on protests, for the most part, we're largely allowed to peacefully assemble. And in some states, we actually have governors that are doing a good job at standing up to Donald Trump to protect our civil liberties and civil rights. Also, elections, they're still competitive and free and mostly fair, money and politics aside. So it's not all bad, or I guess I should say things could be worse, which begs the question, how do we actually know when we finally cross that line into authoritarianism? How will we know when we've actually lost our democracy? And this question was answered by three political scientists in a guest essay for the New York Times: Steven Levitsky, Lucan Way, and Daniel Ziblatt. And spoiler alert, they've concluded that we've already lost our democracy. But they're not alone, because three experts on authoritarianism from Yale University, Jason Stanley, Timothy Snyder, and Marci Shore, conclusively designate the United States as a fascist country in a video essay for the New York Times, where they explain why they've decided to flee the country themselves. Moreover, in an op-ed for Common Dreams, writer Stephen Kagan predicts that things will continue to get worse, which means that we're going to have to accept that we're in the process of witnessing a major collapse in our way of life in America. And the fact that so many experts are saying this is significant. It doesn't mean that their views are indicative of the entire political science community or of all historians, but typically academics are very hesitant to make sweeping declarations like this because social science, much like natural science, is very conservative by nature, and they don't want to make assertions or logical leaps without a sufficient amount of evidence. And another problem is that things aren't always black and white. There's often uncertainty or gray area that complicates categorical judgments. I mean, political scientists, they still don't have a widely agreed upon definition of democracy, and they've mapped out a million different types of authoritarian regimes. So if so many of them are confident enough to deduce that America meets the basic criteria for authoritarianism, then I, for one, am inclined to believe them. And even though their characterization of America is important, understanding how they get there is equally important. So without further ado, let's hear from Levitsky and his colleagues, because what they say is crucial. They write, "In democracies, citizens are not punished for peacefully opposing those in power. They need not worry about publishing critical opinions, supporting opposition candidates, or engaging in peaceful protest because they know they will not suffer retribution from the government. In fact, the idea of legitimate opposition, that all citizens have a right to criticize, organize opposition to, and seek to remove the government through elections, is a foundational principle of democracy. Under authoritarianism, by contrast, opposition comes with a price. Citizens and organizations that run afoul of the government become targets of a range of punitive measures. Politicians may be investigated and prosecuted on baseless or petty charges. Media outlets may be hit with frivolous defamation lawsuits or adverse regulatory rulings. Businesses may face tax audits or be denied critical contracts or lower licenses. Universities and other civic institutions may lose essential funding or tax-exempt status, and journalists, activists, and other critics may be harassed, threatened, or physically attacked by government supporters. When citizens must think twice about criticizing or opposing the government because they could credibly face government retribution, they no longer live in a full democracy. By that measure, America has crossed the line into competitive authoritarianism. The Trump administration's weaponization of government agencies and flurry of punitive actions against critics has raised the cost of opposition for a wide range of Americans. So there's your answer. Love it or hate it. And they go on to list other ways that Trump is engaging in authoritarian behavior using democratic institutions. It's not just that he's targeting media companies. He's also targeting law firms, universities, political opponents. On top of that, politicians are expressing concerns about violence if they don't fall in line, including some Republicans. These trends are all common in other competitive authoritarian regimes, including India, Hungary, Turkey, and others. So basically, you don't have to wait until the president starts executing political opponents in the public square to finally say, this is now officially authoritarianism. It's not a dichotomy. The distance between democracy and authoritarianism has gradations. It exists on a spectrum. And by their estimation, they say that the Trump era has ended the post-Watergate era of America, where democracy was actually starting to flourish, perhaps for the first time. Now, some might argue that America was never a full democracy in the first place, since it doesn't meet the criteria for polyarchy, which is basically the purest form of democracy that I don't think is really possible under capitalism. But either way, they say that we're sliding in one direction on the spectrum, and it's towards authoritarianism, and there's no longer any denying it. And I want to play a clip from the Yale professors that I mentioned earlier, because they basically contextualize what we're currently witnessing, and they do a good job at doing that. So let's hear them.
Toni Morrison warned us.
The descent into a final solution is not a jump. It's one step. And then another. And then another.
We are seeing those steps accelerated right now.
There are some words, in Russian in particular, that I feel help us to understand what's happening in the United States, because we now have those phenomena. Произвол. It's the idea that the powers that be can do anything they want to you, and you have no recourse. This not knowing who is next creates a state of paralysis in society.
The Tufts student whose visa was removed because she co-authored an article in the Tufts student newspaper.
It's a deliberate act of terror. It's not necessary. It's just being done to create a spirit of us and them.
Poland recently went through a shift towards authoritarianism. Unlike in Russia, unlike in Hungary, the media remained a place in Poland where you could criticize the regime. And as a result, democracy returned. You know you're living in a fascist society when you're constantly going over in your head the reasons why you're safe. What we want is a country where none of us have to feel that way.
And if you've ever made these calculations yourself, if you've ever second-guessed whether or not you should make that tweet or post that TikTok video calling Trump a fascist, that right there is an indication in and of itself that you are no longer living in a democratic country. The fear that you're going to become the next Rumeysa Öztürk or Abrigo Garcia is common in authoritarian regimes who make examples out of critics to strike fear in the hearts of everybody else. Now, none of this is new by any means, and what we're seeing, it's been common throughout history. Now, even though Professor Snyder in particular tries to avoid making historical comparisons, he does sound the alarm about statelessness and how this was used in Nazi Germany to legitimize their crimes against humanity. And Professor Snyder says that Trump is literally using that same playbook.
By the time that Auschwitz was established on the territory of what had been a Polish army base at Oświęcim, Poland had been destroyed. But this helps to make the point just in a slightly more subtle way, which is important. The killing of Jews in Germany didn't happen in Germany. It happened in zones which the Germans decided were stateless, in zones where the law didn't apply. And so that could be a concentration camp. The definition of a concentration camp is a lawless zone. But it could also be a broad swath of territory to the east, where the Germans said, we've destroyed the state, whether it's Poland or the Soviet Union, we've destroyed the state, and so the rules don't apply. That, for me, is the dangerous thing, right? Not exactly another country, although that's important, but the idea of statelessness, the notion that what we're going to do is we're going to decide that certain people are beyond the protection of the state in general. Once you do that, then it becomes much easier to ship them away, and it becomes much easier to kill them.
And we all see how Trump is doing this. They've shipped innocent immigrants to a concentration camp in El Salvador. And then they use the excuse that they can't get them back since they don't have jurisdiction over El Salvador, when we know that they would obviously oblige if Trump asked them to return Abrigo Garcia, like the Supreme Court said he should very much do. You know, we've also seen pro-Palestinian students like Mahmoud Khalil get the stateless treatment. Even though he is a permanent resident, he's not a citizen. Therefore, the constitutional protections afforded to citizens aren't being extended to him, even though immigrants also get constitutional protections as well. Like, this is illegal, but he's applying statelessness to individuals who have states, like Mahmoud Khalil, because, you know, him not being a citizen, I guess, legitimizes it in their eyes. There's also the use of Guantanamo Bay, of course. Trump didn't start this. But, you know, moving citizens into zones where the law, domestic law, doesn't apply to them makes it easier for them to abuse power and hide their abuses of power. So what we're seeing is a fascist society that has devolved into a closed authoritarian regime because of all of these things that Donald Trump is doing. Now, the good news is that this is actually still reversible. And Levitsky and his colleagues explain why they think this is the case. Quote, the costs of opposition are surmountable, and importantly, the descent into authoritarianism is reversible. Pro-democracy forces have successfully resisted or reversed backsliding in recent years in Brazil, Poland, Slovakia, South Korea, and elsewhere. America's courts remain independent and will almost certainly block some of the administration's most abusive measures. But judges, themselves targets of violent threats, government harassment, and even arrest, cannot save democracy on their own. Broader societal opposition is essential. That last sentence is key. Broader societal opposition is essential. And they explain that even though signs are emerging that there are people opposed to this in a meaningful way, you know, they are getting out in the streets every weekend, they're protesting, they're showing up at Tesla and protesting, that is in no way sufficient to stop our descent into authoritarianism. You need a mass scale of protests in order to really thwart the threat of fascism. And when Professor Scott Galloway asked Snyder in an episode of his podcast what can be done to reverse this trend, he had the same answer as Levitsky and his colleagues.
Can you point to a point in history or best practices around when a democracy moves towards some sort of authoritarianism or oligarchy or fascism? What can you point to, and what lessons can we take from who's been most effective, and what are the components of that pushback when a country has flirted with fascism and then has been pulled back from the brink? What are the components of pulling back or pushing back?
Mm-hmm. Let me break that question down into two parts, because I think there are two things that work together that help us to answer it. So the question, why aren't we allowed to say fascism, I think is directly related to the answer. So, as you say, it's patently obvious that there has been a return of fascism around the world for quite some time. I started writing about it more than 10 years ago, using the word. And then, as you quite rightly say, that, and one can agree or disagree about how big it is and just who exactly is in it. But I think it's palpably grotesque to deny that there has been a world return of fascism and that didn't begin yesterday. And so then, as you say, if we were confronted with all of these empirical signs of fascism, and again, one can disagree about exactly what fascism is, but the signs, no matter whose definition you take, are overwhelming. It doesn't matter whose definition you take. The signs are overwhelming. They're there. And so why do we not accept that? And I think that has to do with the second part, right? Because if you accept that it's fascism, then you have to organize. And you have to organize with people that you might not necessarily like. Denying that it's fascism is a purely academic pursuit, right? If you deny it's fascism, what you can do is you can sit at your office and you can edit a volume about how it's not fascism. that's just about my colleagues, but more broadly speaking, if you deny it's fascism, then you can imagine, okay, the normal pathways of politics are going to work. Somehow things are going to self-correct. The moment you accept that it's fascism, you have to organize. You have to take action, you have to organize, and you have to organize with people who agree with you and people who don't completely agree with you. And this is part of the answer now to the question, because the way that you beat fascism is with coalitions. The way that you beat fascism is that you get to a majority by including people who don't agree about everything. It has to be a clear majority because they're ruthless, and also they may control aspects of the state. So the way that you pull back is that you get a coalition, right? This is Poland in 2023, for example. The way that you pull back is you get a coalition which can win an election. But this goes to the Democrats. I take the point about the Democrats, but it's very important. I think your analysis is also correct, but it's very important for us who are not activists in the Democratic Party to remember that we have to not make the same mistake that they're making. Like the fact that they are inactive or they don't use a word is not an excuse for us to be inactive and not use the word. We have to create all possible bridges, pageantry, opportunities for those of them who want to make a move. So the more civil society activism there is, the more protesting there is, the more chance there is that you pull the establishment party or important elements of it in your direction.
So as much as liberals and leftists don't want to hear this, we actually do have to at least temporarily put aside our differences and work together to stop fascism. We need the broadest coalition possible, because the odds of us simply defeating fascism by electing a Democrat after Trump, assuming he willingly leaves office this time, it's not necessarily impossible, but it seems low. I mean, perhaps we're saved by muscle memory and we just go back to normal after Donald Trump, but that seems like wishful thinking. It's hard to close Pandora's box once you've opened it, and odds are future Republicans won't go back to being small d Democrats after this. They're almost certainly going to iterate on Trump's authoritarian formula. They're not going to automatically go back to being pre-authoritarian Republicans unless the political cost for being authoritarian becomes too high. They need to see that Americans will not tolerate explicit authoritarianism, and they draw the line at democracy. This is why mass mobilization on a nationwide scale is so crucial, because if the population just sits by and remains passive and lets Trump do everything and take us down this path, there may really be no going back. So if you want to live in a democracy, you have to fight for it. Metaphorically, of course. That means you organize, you protest, you form political coalitions, you educate your peers, and you get them involved. The takeaway is not that all hope is lost, and we should be depressed about this. The takeaway is, yes, we are an authoritarian country now, according to some political scientists, but it's not too late to reverse course. But that window of opportunity is closing.